Welcome. Okay, we're just going to dive right into this explainer because today we are looking at a completely fascinating collision of two worlds you'd probably never expect to see in the same sentence. I mean, ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and modern macroeconomic theory? It's wild, right? We're going to explore this seriously compelling premise coming out of some cutting-edge research. Basically, what if a 2,000-year-old philosophy is the exact tool we need to fix not only our own personal everyday anxieties, but also our completely chaotic, unpredictable global economy? I know, it sounds like a massive claim, but honestly, the data and the models we're about to look at make a surprisingly strong case for it. Let's get into it. So, to understand how this all works, we first got to meet the ancient teacher Epictetus. His entire philosophy really hinges on one single, incredibly powerful thought. It's not events that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. That right there, that is the absolute foundational cognitive principle of Stoicism. Basically, Epictetus is saying our framing dictates our reality. Think about it. You miss a train or, the stock market crashes. The event itself is actually just neutral data out there in the universe. It's your internal judgment about that event that generates the panic, the anger, or the sadness. This is the absolute bedrock we're going to build this entire explanation on today. All right, so let's move right into part one, the roots of action, decoding the Stoic mind. Now, before we go trying to fix the entire global economy, we kind of have to look under a microscope at how a single human thought is actually formed. Like, how do we literally go from seeing an event to taking an action? Well, classical Stoic psychological theory maps this out brilliantly. I know academic papers on Stoicism can get super dense, but we can just break all that jargon down into a really simple A-B equation. On the left side, we have orexis. This is your value ascription and your underlying desire. Basically, it's your deep-seated belief about what is fundamentally good or bad for you. And then over on the right, we've got horme. This is the actual impulse or the judgment to act in a specific moment. So the absolutely crucial point here is that intentional action requires both of these things. You need an underlying belief about what's valuable, that's orexis, which then informs your specific immediate judgment to act, which is horme. And that brings us right to the final trigger, which is the kathekon. This is simply an appropriate action that's prompted by that judgment. But here is the major catch. A kathekon can lead to a truly virtuous act, or it can lead to a massive mistake. And it completely depends on your underlying orexis or beliefs. For example, if your core belief is that hoarding wealth at all costs is the ultimate good in life, well, your resulting action is going to be greedy and ultimately destructive. This beautifully illustrates how just a tiny shift in our initial value ascription fundamentally alters literally every single behavior that follows it.
Which takes us to section 2, training your Stoic brain, looking at real-world resilience.
Okay, so ancient theory is great and all, but let's scale this up to modern individual psychology. Does this cognitive framing actually yield measurable results today, or are we just talking about dusty philosophy? Well, to answer that, we've got to look at the Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training Study, or SMRT for short. This was started in 2014 by Donald J. Robertson, along with a team of cognitive behavioral therapists and classicists. What they did was take these exact ancient principles and test them in a modern clinical setting with thousands of participants. They really wanted to see if treating Stoicism not just as an abstract philosophy, but as a practical daily resilience training program could actually change a person's baseline mental health. And guys, the data is striking. After just 4 weeks of intensive Stoic training, participants reported a 23% decrease in negative emotions and a massive 27% increase in life satisfaction. That is huge. It proves a really important point. Stoicism is absolutely not about being some unfeeling robot or just shoving your emotions down. By fixing those underlying judgments we talked about earlier, participants were actively reducing their sadness while massively boosting their overall flourishing and contentment. So, okay, we know it cures the mind, but here is exactly where we pivot from individual psychology over to macroeconomics. I want to pose a pretty provocative question here. What happens when a psychologically resilient Stoic goes shopping? Like, how does someone who has completely mastered their internal judgments actually behave in a hyper-consumer-driven marketplace? Let's explore that in part 3, Economics of the Indifferent, a new consumer philosophy. We're really going to look at the macroeconomic shift that could happen if millions of these psychologically resilient Stoic individuals all entered the marketplace at exactly the same time. But first, we have to understand the concept of a preferred indifferent. There's this super common misconception out there that Stoics just despise wealth and want everyone to go live in a barrel in the woods. Totally not true. Stoics actually view things like money, health, and social connections as preferred indifference.
They are practically useful. I mean, it's definitely preferred to have money rather than not have it, right? But they aren't fundamentally essential for living a good, virtuous life. The source material highlights that wealth is a tool, and ideally, it's a tool that should be utilized to promote the public good, rather than just, endless personal hoarding.
So, what does a Stoic consumer actually look like? Well, their behavior completely shifts. First off, they accept external events without panic. If the market dips, they don't completely freak out. Second, they reject short-term speculation because, well, they just aren't driven by greed. Third, they focus entirely on long-term value and stability. And finally, they believe wealth should be utilized to facilitate collective virtue and access to material services for society as a whole. Their acceptance of market cycles inherently removes those wild, extreme emotions of fear and greed that constantly plague our current system.
Moving on to Section 4, Virtue as Utility, Redefining Value.
Adopting this philosophical mindset completely rewrites the fundamental mathematics behind everyday consumer choices. Let's look at how economists actually model this. So, in a traditional economy, the consumer's goal is to maximize pure material utility. In economic terms, they maximize U of X and Y, where X and Y are just goods or services. Basically, you just want more stuff that makes you happy. But in a Stoic economy, and this was proposed by researchers Neil Karani and Dita Saravanan, the formula completely changes. You maximize U of V times X and V times Y. You're integrating this vital virtue multiplier, that's the V, into every single transaction. You aren't just looking at something and asking, does this benefit me? You're actually asking, does this transaction contain virtue? Does it actually benefit society? It's a total game changer.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, Stabilizing the Market, the Macro Impact.
Okay, now we're bringing this whole narrative arc to its climax. What actually happens to global markets when this virtue variable is scaled up across an entire economy? Like, what if everyone actually starts acting this way? Well, to appreciate the cure, we kind of have to look at the disease first. Notice the chaotic, jagged peaks and valleys in typical market cycles. This right here is the vicious cycle of market fear and greed. Our economy is completely hijacked by unchecked psychological panic and irrational exuberance. People buy wildly when they're feeling greedy, which creates these massive bubbles, and then they sell frantically when they're afraid, which triggers crashes. Economists actually model those chaotic business cycles using a sine wave, which is shown in this equation. Y equals alpha x plus beta minus sigma times the sine of x. Now don't worry, we're not going to do too much math here, but here is what you really need to know. The beta in this equation, that represents consumer panic and greed. It's a thing making the wave go wildly up and down. But sigma represents the powerful stabilizing effect of the Stoic mindset. And this is exactly what happens when you introduce that Stoic sigma variable into the mix. Mathematically, it completely reduces the volatility. As people adopt Stoic mindfulness, those extreme emotional reactions just disappear. The coefficient shrinks, and that chaotic boom and bust sine wave is smoothed right out into a trajectory of steady, predictable linear growth. You are quite literally flattening the curve of economic panic. It's amazing. So what are the actual real-world takeaways from all this data? Well, a Stoic economy brings massive macro benefits. We see the total elimination of speculative bubbles because people just aren't acting on short-term greed anymore. We get predictable linear GDP growth. We see a decreased Gini coefficient, which is basically a fancy way of saying lower income inequality, mostly because wealth is viewed as a tool for public good rather than for endless hoarding. And finally, innovation is driven by mutual societal benefit. You see, a Stoic economy doesn't kill growth, not at all. It simply redirects it towards sustainable, equitable progress for everyone. So we've seen how shifting our internal values from the microscopic level of just a single thought can radically alter our personal happiness. And we've seen how scaling that exact same shift up can literally stabilize global markets. Which leaves us with this final thought. If a 2,000-year-old philosophy has the mathematical and psychological power to cure both our minds and our markets, well, what's stopping you from changing your opinions today? Harness the micro power of your own mind, and you might just help drive macro-level change. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the way you look at the world.